Thank you all for coming today. So I'm Jess Young. I'm a Commissioner at the Essential Services Commission. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, and that's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. That's where I am, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands that you might be on today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that are participating in the session today. So I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the connection that First Nations people hold to country and culture and their ongoing strength in practicing the world's oldest living culture. We recognise the contribution of First Nations people and their communities to Victorian life and how this continues to enrich our society more broadly. So I'm joined today by my fellow commissioners, so Gerard, Brody and Rebecca Billings, as well as Elly Patira, who's on a sabbatical from her commissioner role while she's acting as the interim CEO at Gellung, Warl, and we're very grateful to have her back in this room with us today. I'd like to also acknowledge the former commissioners on the call today, and that's our former chairperson, Kate Simons, also Simon Corden and Ron Ben David are here, as well as the former CEO, John Hamill. So all of these people were very strong advocates for the Commission's work on consumer vulnerability and the very first Getting to Fair strategy during their time at the Commission. I'm pleased to see there's quite a number of attendees from the water sector, but also from energy businesses, from government departments and the community sectors here today, as well as some consumer representatives and individual consumers, and also some First Nations representatives, as well as a good proportion of ESC staff. So thank you for being here. The success of this strategy is going to require a lot of collaboration and insights from everybody. So it's really wonderful to have people engaged in this work, as we see it as really important. So today we're releasing our updated Getting to Fair Advancing Equity strategy. And as part of that, we're also releasing our very first flagship framework under the strategy, and that's our First Nations self-determination framework. So I know I speak for all of the commissioners when I say that we're really, really proud of this strategy and the framework. The documents we're putting out today are going to set a really strong and clear direction that aligns with our broader strategic plan, and it's going to help guide work across all of our functions and the industries that we regulate. So in today's webinar, you're going to hear from Commissioners Gerard, Brody and Elly Patira, and our guest speaker is Sue Fraser OAM, who I'll introduce in a moment. But before I hand over to the speakers, I've got some brief housekeeping matters I need to cover. So first up, you might have noticed we're recording today's webinar, and we're going to make this recording available after the event. So although it is lovely to see everyone's faces, if you'd prefer not to be shown in the recording, you'll need to turn your camera off. So after we've heard from our speakers, there's going to be an opportunity for questions from you. So please use the chat if you've got questions for our speakers, but we're also very happy if you'd like to put your hand up using the hand up function in the Q&A and during the question and answer time, and we can take your questions that way. So we have around 10 minutes for questions, and we're going to try and get to as many as we can in that time. So now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, which is Sue Fraser OAM. So Sue has more than 50 years experience in the welfare sector across Victoria and Australia, and she's a passionate advocate for addressing consumer vulnerability. Sue has been recognised in many ways and was awarded an Order of Australia Medal in 2021 for her contribution to financial counselling and innovative programs. Sue has a long-standing relationship with the Commission. She is the first community co-chair of our Community Sector Roundtable, which I think a number of you are members of. And as some of you might remember, she spoke at the launch of the ESC's first Getting to Fair strategy in 2021. And at that event, Sue reflected on the need for the strategy and described her feelings of optimism for the work, noting the willingness of all of us to work together in a collaborative fashion is what was going to make the difference. So it's 5 years on since then, since our first Getting to Fair strategy, and we've invited Sue to share her reflections today on where we've come from, what what has been achieved by all of us together and where we need to go from here. So thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Jess. It's hard to believe it is 5 years on, actually. Hopefully I'm a little bit wiser because I'm certainly older. I think one of the things that I find really pleasing about this iteration of Getting to Fair is around the recognition that fairness and equity is paramount in the work that we do across a whole range of sectors. And it's not separate from economic regulation. And that's something that often regulators haven't come to that learning at this stage. When I think about getting to fair, I hear, are we there yet? And the answer is clearly no, we're not. But hopefully we're on the right pathway to achieve that. Some of the things that I think is really important that we've talked about over the years in many different environments is around, acknowledging what happens to the individual's clear opportunity to recognise what happens more systemically and reducing barriers for particular individuals or for all individuals. It gives us a different framework and a different pathway. And that can be achieved in lots of different ways. When I think about what I spoke about last time, I think I'm still optimistic. And in fact, I'm probably more optimistic now than I was then, because I think it gives us a different vision around what can be achieved. And it can only be done collaboratively. When I work across industries now and meet people from organisations, particularly in energy, there's so much enthusiasm to do better. And there's lots of barriers to enable that are not allowing that to happen. There's always good people doing good work. When I was an FC, I never worried about a financial counsellor. I never worried about the people I saw. I always worried about the people I didn't get to see and how would they navigate the service system that they were trying to get a fair and reasonable outcome from, which is why often they needed a financial counsellor to help them achieve those outcomes. And it always concerned me that when someone rang a business, they were often not believed. But when a financial counsellor rang, they could say the same words in the same way and ask for the same outcome, and it would be provided to them. And that never made sense. Many years ago, about 10 years ago now, I did a TEDx talk that focused on turning vulnerability into strength. And I think that we often have a perception about people that we think have a range of vulnerabilities and therefore often struggle with different elements of life. But in the talk, I spoke about the worst 6 weeks of my life and how with a range of events, it actually was quite destabilising for me then to advocate on my own behalf. And I won't go into what those things were, but enough to say that what it meant is that my ability to advocate on my behalf was diminished. My ability to think through situations and information given to me were limited. My capabilities were diminished. And it wasn't about I didn't have money to do what I needed to do. It was about I didn't have the mental ability to process what needed to be done and therefore do it. So when people think about vulnerability, they often think about the financial constraints, and it's much more than that. It's often about life circumstances that we find limiting. It's about trauma that we all experience at different times in our life and how that changes how we process information and how we behave. It's really important to reframe vulnerability, and people who know me know that I often talk about we all experience vulnerabilities at different stages, and in fact we're all on a continuum. And one of the things I often pose to businesses over time is, if these circumstances happen to you, how would you navigate the service system? Would your business give you the support that you needed to stabilise and to be able to move forward? And unfortunately, the reality is in a lot of cases, that support doesn't exist in the way that it needs to. And it's not because people aren't committed to trying to do good work. It's often the systems they sit in, the delegations they have, the time frame they've got, the expectation of their organisation doesn't allow them to do what needs to be done. When when I look at organisations and I look at their QA frameworks, for example, they're written around risk and compliance, which is a thing that most businesses take quite seriously, obviously, because of the financial penalties. And what are we up to now? Is it $77 million of penalties that have been awarded? And that's because businesses haven't been able to follow the regulations required or haven't delivered the service that they had intended. None of these things are done in a deliberate context, of course, but it is about what flexibility people have to deliver the role and the outcomes that they know should be in place. I actually sat in a call centre, an energy retailer call centre, for a couple of days at the beginning of the year, and it actually changed the way that I thought about how businesses respond to consumers broadly, but consumers with a range of vulnerabilities. The bit that I found difficult was that the conversations were so constrained and so pragmatic, and people being so aware they had to meet and hit so many compliance requirements rather than engage in a conversation that was meaningful. And it was quite constraining in the way they felt the questions they asked, the processes they had to follow. When I look at the regulations, I see the intent. And then it's up to business to determine how they deliver on those intents and those requirements. And it's not in the pragmatic framework that I see often. When I look across industries, as I do, because I work in a whole lot of spaces, there are businesses, say in banking and finance, in insurance, in debt collection, in superannuation, in any industry that are struggling with how do we respond to people who are not able to meet the requirements of what the organisation expects. And some of them are doing and delivering quite good work. I mean, if we look at banking and finance, there's now a requirement to provide extra care. It doesn't stipulate what that is. And businesses, particularly banks, have interpreted that in different ways. Some successfully, some not so successfully. When we look at insurance, again, there's been some work done by insurers that now look at behaviour of others when we think about family violence, where insurance is often used as a weapon to cause physical harm or structural harm to someone as a result of the relationship that they're in. So there's now a clause about behaviours of others. So if someone's deliberately harming a property or burning a property down or damaging a car to hurt the other policyholder, the policy now can be paid out to the victim of that behaviour. Now, 2 or 3 years ago, we would have thought that impossible. You know, in insurance also, there's now, you know, what's in the consumer's best interest or the policyholder's best interest. And again, particularly around elder abuse, someone might have a power of attorney and therefore be paid a settlement for damage or harm that's been caused to a property, and the payment might never go to rectifying that issue for the person who's the policyholder. So the insurance company now will look at, is that in the best interest of the person holding that policy? And if not pay a cash settlement, but actually pay for the work to be done. As I said, when we look across industries, there's some really good work being done that businesses don't have to make their own mistakes. They can actually learn from others. I was around when the Office of the Regulator General was created. So we're talking 1923-24. And one of the first activities of that, for people who are around will be smiling because it was torturous, I have to say, when the first retail code came into play. And there were some really strong and fabulous consumer advocates, Gavin Dufty and Dennis Nelthorpe, who were leading the charge then about what consumer rights and protections should be in place. We thought we did fairly well, but when we look back now, our world was too small. We weren't thinking broad enough. And then that converted to the ESC around 2000, 2001, I think. Some of the exciting work that's come out of that is we have learnt as we've gone. Consumers are still saying, though, they're having similar issues that they had then, which are still around unaffordable payment arrangements, you know, not getting the concessions that they're entitled to, you know, not having ERGs applied in a way that's timely that benefits them, not the business. And I do have to wonder why that is. Where did we not, as consumer advocates and as business and regulators, how do we have the same issues now that we had 10 and 15 years ago when there's been so much work done in this space? And I think getting to FAIR, the payment difficulty framework, all of the things that have been done and the consultations and communication that's gone on, these are still live issues for consumers. And again, I do wonder how that possibly can be. In the world I move, I talk to regulators, I talk to ombudsmen, I talk to businesses, I talk to the financial counselling industry, and importantly, I talk to consumers about what their experience is of the regulated world that they operate within in utilities. In the past, if you talk to a consumer, there would be very little positive that they could say about retailers, to be honest. You know, the trust barometer is fairly low. When I talk to consumers now, there's often some in a group who will talk about a positive experience where they connected with someone who they felt cared about them, where they felt that the business had their best interests at heart and provided information that they needed in a timely and in compassionate way. But that might only be 2 out of 10. You know, if we do it getting to FAIR in another 5 years, I would hope that would be 8 or 9 out of 10. As I said, when I look at retailers, there's really good people trying to do really good work. But at times the rubber just doesn't hit the road. You know, vulnerability programs have been built. You know, they used to be called hardship programs. We're now calling them nicer words, which are easier to roll off the tongue. But often people go into these programs in a particular financial state and they come out in a worse state. And again, I wonder how that can happen. I've seen energy debts as low as $12 and I've seen them more than $40,000. And in both cases, I question how has that occurred and how can it be remedied? There's a tendency always to wait for debts to be quite high, and this has been a systemic issue all along. Whereas if we had early intervention prevention programs that when people got to $200 or $300 or $400 and had an intervention point that provided information and support, people, in my view, wouldn't escalate through that debt cycle. But businesses, I don't think, see the value in intercepting early when the debt's low without having a bigger picture view of what that means. It's really important when we look at what's happening in the industry. We know the ombuds complaints have gone up, was it 24 or 25%? We know that organisations that provide food relief, 60% of people presenting now have a mortgage and therefore will have other stresses. I've never worked with an individual who's only had one debt. It's always the complexity of both issues and finances that leads them to that. You know, we know that finding adequate staff and training them properly is a real challenge. And staff turnover is enormous. And I think people need to wonder, businesses need to wonder why that is. You know, we know that up to 20-25% of consumers will move to a different energy provider. It's much cheaper to keep someone and keep them supported rather than have to attract new customers continually. So when I look at the way businesses operate in this space, I see an opportunity-rich environment. And that's a term I've used very often in a lot of environments, a lot of spaces. But it makes no sense to me that we don't work with people early, support them in their difficulty and retain them as customers. Because every contact with a consumer, as you know, comes at a cost. You know, by the time they're onboarded, by the time there's a few letters go out in welcoming them, when someone's in difficulty, there'll be a few phone calls, there'll be a few SMSs, there'll be a few more letters. All of those things come at a cost. I don't know what a letter would be these days, but I would imagine it would be, a phone call would be maybe $15 to $17 per contact. That's all cost to a business that doesn't necessarily happen for someone who's on an arrangement that they can afford and who's happy with the service that they receive. I think part of the challenge also is not just keeping people, but attracting the right people and having really values-based recruitment in an organisation, regardless of where they come into that organisation, because there should be no wrong door for a consumer. Any touch point should be an opportunity to identify issues, provide support, demonstrate care and show respect. There's lots of organisations in the community sector doing fantastic work and who some retailers now work within a collaborative space, only for the good. You know, the influence and input of the consumer voice is becoming more important, and that's been outlined in the Getting to Fair document. You know, how do industries use consumer voices to help determine their strategy and their business practice? And there's real intelligence and wealth in that information if businesses are open to it and use it well. You know, when I talk across organisations in the community sector, CALC Uniting, CISVIC, the Community Information Centres, you know, the Brotherhood, Financial Counselling, all of those organisations are still saying the same thing, that there's often difficulty in accessing ERGs. Unaffordable payments is the main criteria. People with enormous outstanding debt that can't be reached. Again, I wonder where we go from here. How do we, as a community, as a broader community, including retailers, think about what it is that the aim and the outcome of what they're trying to achieve? You know, I often look at businesses doing a lot of consumer mapping and consumer journey mapping. And although that's useful and interesting for the businesses to understand the process, it doesn't tell them what the impact is. And again, that as a concept has been something that's really been the last 10 years in having a concern and an eye for what does a consumer process look like. And when we look at them, we often see people almost on a rotation who might form a payment arrangement, get out of difficulty, go off for a period of time and then come back to be in difficulty again. That leads me to think what could have happened differently in the first outcome to help people stabilise and not come back. It's a challenge to think about that over the longevity of the work that we've all been doing and always working towards a bigger outcome. I mean, often when I'm talking to businesses, they talk about regulation being a stifler for innovation, and the frustration that they experience and the concern around additional regulation and what that means for their business and their systems and the cost in delivering services. While all that might be well true, there also has to be an eye about how did we get to where we are and how do we make sure that as a business the regulation as they come becomes a different opportunity rather than a limiting factor. When I read the regulation, what I read is the intention rather than the words. And when I look at retailers, they see the words, not the intention as well. The real benefit and distractor to that is how do you see through the pragmatism of what regulation is to deliver a better and more holistic outcome, for now, not just for now, but into the future. I'm still optimistic, I have to say. I don't know if I'll be around next round, but I hope I can observe it. I think there is such wisdom out there in retailers and in the community sector and with consumers. As a collective, we need to work out then how do we use that wisdom and that intelligence to help craft and deliver better outcomes. And I really hope, hand on heart, that this is a new opportunity almost to start again and reflect on what we're doing and why, and what do we want the long-term outcome to be. Because the only way forward is to support people who are vulnerable because they will right themselves in life in most circumstances and become your best advocates, rather than those who jump from organisation to organisation and often leave a litany of debt with each new connection, and then struggle even further because not only do they have existing usage, but they've also got past debt that they can't straddle. New opportunity, new optimism, lots of ways to do it, and I wish everyone the best of luck in achieving that. Back to you, Gerard.
Thank you so much, Sue. So valuable to hear your insights and perspectives over such a long period in this sector, and I think also to hear such strong support for the direction that we're really hoping to take here. I think your comments about vulnerability at the start and really hark back to the definition of vulnerability that the Commission established with the first Getting to Fair strategy around, circumstantial vulnerability. And I think it's always really important for us to hear that and remember that. I think more broadly, your comments about outcomes are really critical to the direction of the Commission that we're trying to really keep a focus on, and that runs a thread through this strategy. So thank you so much. So our next speaker is Gerard Brody, Commissioner and Chairperson, and Gerard's going to tell us more about the new Getting to Fair Advancing Equity strategy. Over to you, Gerard.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Sue, also for your remarks. Folk on this call will be aware that the Commission set a new strategic plan last year and a new vision, which is for fair and dependable essential services today and tomorrow. That emphasis on tomorrow reflects our legislative objective to promote the long-term interests of Victorian consumers. And as an economic regulator, we are concerned with efficiency and well-functioning markets. These are really important to promote the long-term interests of consumers. But we also recognise that good outcomes for all Victorian consumers require us to consider a range of other factors as well. So in addition to efficiency, in addition to well-functioning markets, strong consumer outcomes depend on whether services are accessible, whether they're inclusive, trusted, and responsive to the diversity of our community. So, I think many people on this call will be aware through their work and engagement with consumers and communities, we all see outcomes which may appear efficient on one level, but produce some poor outcomes for some consumers or communities. It might be just that individual household unable to access a better energy offer because their digital systems are difficult to navigate. Or it could be, somebody falling behind on bills because systems of support are hard to access or understand. It could be, regional or First Nations communities experiencing services differently because, markets and the systems weren't designed with their circumstances in mind. So our strategy that we're launching today aims to support a fairer sharing of the costs, benefits and risks of the essential services we regulate, and looking at all Victorian consumers, including diverse consumers and groups and future generations. And so this strategy will support the Commission's regulatory and decision-making and outlines the considerations that guide our approach. As Sue mentioned, the updated strategy does build on the first Getting to Fair strategy, which ran from 2021 to 2024. That strategy really marked that shift in understanding of consumer vulnerability. So it's not what someone is, but rather something that can occur when people face barriers to accessing or engaging with essential services. And this definition continues to guide our work. The actions in our first strategy were largely focused on reducing barriers experienced by individual consumers, and that does remain a focus. What we're broadening through this strategy is to have a greater emphasis on, the broader systems, market settings, institutional practice that really shape consumer outcomes. I wanted to thank everyone that participated in the consultation on our draft strategy, which we conducted from December to February this year. We received really valuable feedback during consultation. And so, yeah, thank you everyone on this call and more broadly who provided feedback. And thank you for your patience as we worked through and incorporated that feedback into the strategy. And we have made important changes in response to your feedback. That includes providing more information about how equity informs our approach to economic regulation and efficiency, and you'll see a new appendix that goes into more detail. Also, how the strategy actually informs our regulatory decision making and how we use it in our regulatory approaches in our work. And after today's event, we'll be publishing a public engagement summary on our website, which provides more detail about what we heard during the consultation and how we responded to this feedback. So just to move to the strategy itself. So the goal of the strategy is to promote just outcomes and equitable access to essential services for all Victorians today and tomorrow. So we talk about just outcome. When we talk about just outcomes, we mean the fair distribution of those costs, benefit and risks of essential services. And when we talk about equitable access, we mean that all consumers are able to access the essential services we regulate and administer, regardless of their circumstances. As part of this strategy, we are developing two important flagship frameworks. The first is the First Nations Self-Determination Framework, which we'll hear a bit more about from Commissioner Patira in a moment. And the second framework will focus on energy justice. And that's a concept that we want to work with interested parties, businesses, communities, to involve them in the developing of that framework over the next period of time. So the framework is also designed to be flexible. Often you'll see a strategy that's got a very long list of actions after the strategy. We're actually shifting away from that style slightly, and we'll have actions that are updated each year in our annual work program. But they are which is also being released today for 26-27. But there are three sort of themes that those actions are listed under. So the first is around business conduct, the second is around system level responses, and the third is around regulatory inclusion, really ensuring our regulatory approaches reflect the needs and experiences of diverse consumers. And all our work under the strategy will be supported by 4 pillars, which are listed on that slide, designed to support our work and embed considerations of justice and equity into all our work. As I said, this strategy is meant to be dynamic and flexible, but not without accountability. We've received many suggestions for potential actions and submissions, and we'll continue to engage through our regular roundtables and engagements, including through project-specific consultations. The insights we receive from all these forums, along with other data and insights and the voices of consumers, will inform those updating of priority actions each year. So just in terms of what the first year will look like, a major focus will be developing our capability to develop our first flagship framework, the First Nations Self-Determination Framework. We'll also be having other priority actions across our first year. And it's really building on some of the existing work that we're doing and improving our focus of this work to focus on consumer outcomes and what the change we want to see that promotes that fairness for consumers and community. And some of them are listed there on that slide. I won't go through each of them. In conclusion, we're really excited to be releasing the strategy today. I looked through the list of attendees today and I can see there's many different folk from organisations and sectors. And I want to thank you again for your contributions, and I'm reminded of how much we can accomplish when we work together. and all of us at the Commission really look forward to working in partnership with you all. Back to you, Jess.
Thanks, Gerard. Yeah, we're really excited about this strategy, and I think, as you've heard, there's quite a work program attached to it and a lot of opportunity for engagement. So we're looking forward to, continuing the conversation as we embark. So I'd like to now pass over to Elly Patira. So Elly is currently the acting interim CEO at Gellung Warl. And so in doing that, she's on sabbatical from her role as a commissioner at the Commission. So Elly is here today to tell us more about the First Nations Self-Determination Framework. This framework is something that we are incredibly proud of. It's a very strong framework, and it sets a clear direction to enable First Nations-led outcomes in our work and within the businesses that we regulate. And it builds on this commitment that's already in our strategic plan to enable First Nations self-determination. So over to you, Elly.
Thanks so much, Jess, and it's such a pleasure to be here and to be able to introduce our First Nations self-determination strategy. And before I get into the nuts and bolts of it, I just did really want to reflect for a second on the why. The why do we need this strategy in the first place? And, in thinking about it and in its development, it really came down to two reasons from an ESC perspective. And the first is perhaps an obvious one, but it's that First Nations people are ultimately impacted not only by the regulatory decisions that we make, but also by a lot of the organisational decisions that we make as well. First Nations people are impacted in all of the obvious ways as consumers and as ratepayers, but equally First Nations people are also holders of particular rights relating to land, water, cultural heritage and protection that so often intersect with the decisions that we make around energy and water and the other sectors that we regulate. We also know that there are First Nations businesses and traditional owner groups who are interested in becoming regulated entities or providing service, or who otherwise provide service supports to consumers who are also impacted by our regulatory decisions. And internally, we're really conscious that we have the opportunity to use First Nations contractors and to make sure that we are an employer of choice for First Nations people. So there's so many different ways that we can and do intersect with First Nations people in our work here at the Essential Services Commission. The second reason why we need this strategy is that we know that First Nations people experience inequitable regulatory outcomes. And Sue and Gerard have spoken to this beautifully, and they've particularly spoken to the fact that vulnerability is not something that you are. It is an experience or a set of factors that can occur to a person at different points in their lives. For First Nations people, we know that there is an experience of higher rates and often intersectional types of vulnerability because of the systemic and the cultural legacies of colonisation and dispossession and exclusion. And so I wanted to be really clear before we talk about our First Nations self-determination strategy that First Nations people, we are not inherently vulnerable. However, we do face the realities of these inequitable outcomes and continue to demonstrate really immense strength and resilience when faced with these ongoing legacies, and that thinking very much has informed the way we've moved forward. We have data to confirm so many of these inequitable outcomes for First Nations consumers. We know that there are disproportionate barriers to accessing essential services. For example, First Nations consumers are 11% more likely to have a debt on a closed energy account and are more likely than other energy users to be struggling with their bills at 88% compared to 62% for non-First Nations people. Beyond that, we've also heard from Victorian traditional owner groups, those who I've talked about with land and water and cultural and resource rights, and who also have other cultural and spiritual and economic interests that are tied to country, that their rights aren't routinely understood or protected in our regulatory decisions. Finally, we know that there are shortfalls in the way that we engage with First Nations consumers and businesses and other First Nations groups. and that there are real barriers for First Nations people in being able to influence our regulatory decisions, and that it very much is the why behind this strategy. When it comes to self-determination and the role of the regulator, for regulators like the Commission, enabling self-determination presents both an opportunity but also equally a challenge. As regulators, we don't set policy and legislation, and instead we're responsible for implementing and ensuring adherence to laws and regulations that have already been established by policymakers and legislators. And that obviously means that our scope and our discretion to enable self-determination, for example, by being able to empower traditional owners to participate as equal decision makers on specific matters, or our ability to otherwise advance First Nations rights and interests through our regulatory decision making, for example, by requiring economic benefits to flow to traditional owners as part of a licensing decision. These things are ultimately limited by the very specific legislative, regulatory and policy frameworks within which we operate. However, despite any of those limitations, what we are very clear about is there are existing regulatory powers and tools that are available to the Essential Services Commission that can and will support progress towards achieving equitable, self-determined regulatory outcomes for and with First Nations people. Our First Nations self-determination framework consolidates and builds on a lot of our previous strategies and action plans to improve First Nations outcomes that are within our organisational and regulatory remit. But equally, they reflect Victorian and Commonwealth government policy and commitments. The development of this framework was also informed by targeted engagement with quite a diverse range of First Nations representatives, many who have joined us today, and that includes Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and other community organisations that support First Peoples consumers, Victorian traditional owner groups, the First Nations Clean Energy Network, Bundungerring Working Group, and other government and legislative bodies, including the First Nations team at DECA. I think what this consultation really highlighted is the gaps in our practice as well as the opportunities for improvement. And it really helped us to form a vision and strategic priorities that will shape our work over the coming years. We also received some really strong submissions to the draft Advancing Equity Strategy regarding First Nations consumers and outcomes, which we also considered in actually strengthening this framework and has been so important to where we've landed. Ultimately, the vision for our framework is that First Nations people can equitably access, deliver, engage with and benefit from the essential services we regulate and influence. And to achieve this goal, our framework has outlined 3 strategic priorities. Firstly, and I think really importantly, is we want to make sure that we're building the internal capabilities and the workforce to understand and support First Nations rights and interests. Our second strategic priority is all around regulatory inclusion. This includes not only how we engage well and how we but I think beyond that, it's about how do we actually meaningfully respond to the kind of things that are coming up through First Nations engagement. How do we actually use the existing regulatory frameworks and the tools at our disposal to better include consideration of First Nations rights and interests to achieve really meaningful outcomes? And finally, our third strategic priority focuses on our role in contributing to treaty and self-determination reform. Essentially, that work is quite obviously ongoing. What we want to be able to contribute to is making sure that we provide expertise and skills that exist within the Commission to be collaborators and contributors to quality First Nations-led reform across the sectors we regulate. And we know that will occur through existing treaty work and self-determination work across the Victorian Government and the Commonwealth Government. We also really want to be an active collaborator and participant in making sure that the kind of regulatory design and reform opportunities that are possible through treaty are the best they can be, and that First Nations people are informed and have knowledge and understanding of our sectors in negotiating further treaty outcomes. So what will year one look like for us? The framework really does position us to be able to enable self-determination by building our capabilities and workforce. So really focusing on that internal aspect first, building that understanding of First Nations rights and interests, and building them into our regulatory activities and decision-making. Our inaugural year, as I said, it's really important that we get that internal capability and relationships with First Nations people and organisations down pat, so that we can create a really strong enabling environment for the outcomes that we want to achieve with First Nations people. Nonetheless, while we are looking very much internally over the first year, we do have some really exciting external projects that are either underway or planned, and that includes a place-based data study in collaboration with the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action's First Peoples Energy team to assess how First Nations people in the Framlingham and Lake Tyers communities engage with the Victorian energy market. And we'll provide updates on our website and through our annual report each year against the outcomes achieved through this strategy. As we've heard, the goal of advancing equity is to promote just outcomes and equitable access to essential services for all Victorians today and tomorrow. Our First Nations self-determination framework supports this goal and really does move the Commission forward from just thinking about engaging with First Nations people as consumers to really understanding them as rights and interest holders in all of the work that we do. We know that enabling self-determination is the best way forward to reduce the systemic barriers First Nations people experience in our sectors, and the Commission is incredibly committed to being a leading regulator in this space, demonstrating that there are very practical steps that all regulators can take to support equitable regulatory participation and outcomes for and with First Nations people. I look forward to working with commissioners and staff as we really cement these early foundations for the Commission to lead this work, but equally to working with our stakeholders and within the sectors we regulate to progress this work into the future.
Thanks, Elly. We're so indebted to you, Elly, in helping to bring this strategy and framework today, and I think super grateful for all of the hard work that you've put into it, and particularly coming back, whilst in another role. So thank you so much. It's now time for we've got exactly 10 minutes left for our Q&A session. So I'd like to hand over to Commissioner Rebecca Billings, who's going to facilitate that Q&A. So Rebecca was actually a commissioner when the first Getting to Fair strategy, the only one of us who's been around that long, and has been really instrumental in the development of both the original and the updated strategy. So thank you to Rebecca. Over to you.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes. I don't see any hands up and there's no questions in the chat, but feel free to jump and be the first to ask a question. Otherwise, I'll take the speaker's prerogative and direct a question to Gerard in particular. From the first Getting to Fair to our new version, we have broadened our approach from looking at the individual customer and consumer to a system-wide approach. Can you tell me a bit more about that, Gerard?
Yeah, so I guess this updated strategy really means that equity will shape how the Commission goes about its core regulatory tasks and how it uses our tools, rather than being sort of something that's separate, that's sitting along or underneath other pieces of work. So I'll give you some examples. In our compliance and enforcement work, we're really going to be interested not just looking at whether businesses technically follow a process, but whether it is considered and acted fairly and reasonably in the circumstances. and we want to focus more on the the actual outcome for customers. I think in thinking about how we develop and design rules, we really want to be clearer about the outcomes businesses are expected to deliver. I mean, prescription plays a part in our rules unavoidably, but prescription can't, I guess, anticipate every outcome. So we're going to be focusing on greater use of outcomes-based obligations and require businesses to consider whether customers can genuinely access support, understand what's going on, receive a fair outcome, rather than sort of a simple checklist. And maybe the third thing I'll mention, Rebecca, I think in this shift, our use of data, I think, will be increasingly critical. I think we do collect a lot of information from regulated businesses here at the Commission, but I think we need to move beyond just measuring whether protections exist or how often they're used, to better understand whether they're working in practice. So, are customers receiving the assistance early enough? Are looking at different outcomes across customer groups, like that project that Elly mentioned in relation to First Nations communities. Understanding what are the particular barriers at a system level to people engaging with businesses or people falling out of support systems. I think that understanding that level of data will then help us. It will inform us, it will inform the marketplace, but also influence, I guess, that full regulatory cycle from where we target our compliance action, where we provide guidance to businesses, what rules need to change, and so on. So I think it's overall, we're trying to embed this much more fully within our whole regulatory approach, and I think that's an important shift.
Thanks, Gerard. No hands up, so I will ask another question. Oh, Jo Lim. Jo, would you like to put your camera on and introduce yourself? Lovely to see you.
Hello everyone. Yes, I'm Jo. I'm the CEO at VicWater, the Victorian Water Industry Association. We're the peak body for Victorian water corporations. Firstly, congrats to all of you for the strategy and the First Nations self-determination framework. Fantastic work. I, of course, was looking carefully to see mentions of water throughout these presentations. It seems to me there was a number of projects and initiatives that were focused on energy, but unless I missed it, I didn't see anything specifically in relation to water. So just wondering if you have anything in mind in terms of implementing the strategy and the self-determination framework specifically for water, and maybe in the context of the price submissions coming up in 2028. It would be really useful to hear from you about that. Thanks.
Gerard,
I can start us off.
Yeah,
no, thanks for your question, Jo. And I think it definitely water is a key part of a key part of this strategy. And as you mentioned, the price review process coming up for water businesses across the state in 2028 will be part of that. We, in economic regulation in particular, we're aware that improving equity can require investment, and those costs need to be considered. So we will continue to look at whether investment is producing, that benefit, that does it deliver meaningful benefits, and what are the costs already being created by a system that's maybe not working for everyone. So embedding some of this thinking in our approach to decision making around pricing will be part of it. The other part of it is, and I might throw to Elly as well, is particularly around engagement is a big part of the water pricing framework, and we actually just released yesterday a draft of water guidance to the industry ahead of the 2028 reviews, and we're seeking feedback from industry and others on that. And one shift we are making in that guidance is engagement with First Nations peoples, including, I think water businesses have done good work around engaging with First Nations customers, but we're setting, I guess, improved expectations around the rights and interests of traditional owners as well, and the partnerships that may develop between water businesses and traditional owner groups. to get mutual benefit. But I might throw to Elly if you want to add to that.
I think in general answer to Joe's question, I would say what is very clear with the First Nations framework, it is sector neutral, and what it's really focused on is what are the regulatory frameworks and tools that we have at large across all of the sectors we regulate that provide an opportunity to think more carefully about First Nations rights and interests in the way that we respond on all manner of things, and we step through the different tools at our disposal, so many of which apply in the water sector. I think importantly, and Gerard's already pointed it out, we're trying to already through the Primo water pricing framework really move beyond just the engagement piece of the puzzle to think about what are the outcomes that are also reflected in water pricing submissions. And I think that's a real move, and really creating, I suppose, water businesses have talked about it as a authorising environment from the regulator to say that First Nations rights and interests do matter in the way that water is priced.
Thanks, Elly, and thanks, Gerard. We have a question in the chat from Simon Corden, who is an ex-commissioner of the Essential Services Commission and now chair of the Victorian Ombudsman. A question about measuring impact, and this refers back to Sue's comments about how to make sure that we are making a difference. So any thoughts about how we can develop some measures and hold ourselves to account on that?
Yeah, I can jump in now. Thanks for your question, Simon. I totally agree with the suggestion. And as I mentioned, a big focus on greater and better use of data to understand whether regulatory systems and protections are working is part of this strategy. And if you're going to work out whether things are working, you have to set some metrics about, justifying that they are achieving outcomes and identifying where the gaps might be, which then informs action. And really, I see systems of measurement being about that continual improvement, reflection and continual improvement over time. The Commission has also, under our broader strategic plan, set a range of metrics. And so this Getting to Fair strategy will feed directly into that, particularly under the equitable services domain. So we have set some metrics already there, and we are measuring them each year. But yes, I totally think it'll be something that we can continue to work on as the strategy's rolled out.
Yeah, and Simon, Sue, jump in.
Yeah, for me, it's looking at it from consumer's perspective. It's about, some of the things that I think need to be measured is early intervention and prevention programs and their effectiveness. Uplifting the amount of concessions that are granted for those who are missing out at the moment. The use and misuse of VERGs in a way that actually helps people financially stabilise. How debt and arrears are managed. Are all, from a consumer perspective, are all clear indicators that things are moving in the right direction. And comes with that is staff satisfaction, because if they've got one head time behind their back in the job that they need to do, how do you free that up so that they can make a different decision earlier to help someone stabilise and get on with the other real issues in their life? There's so much opportunity in this space. It's a bit, not quite mind-boggling, but it's actually quite exciting. We just need to get on to the doing.
Thanks, Sue. That's a really great point to end on, I think. So if there are other questions, this is certainly just the launch, and there'll be lots of opportunities, either formally or informally, to reach out to us and continue the conversation. And like we've all said throughout, this has to be a collaborative approach and not a regulator telling its regulated entities what to do. With that, I will hand over to Jess to close.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I'd just like to say thank you to all of the speakers today and to all of you for joining us. And on behalf of all of the commissioners, to say thank you so much for your active engagement and participation. I think it's particularly great to see such a discussion about measurement and outcomes. I think that's that's actually the real focus of this work, as I see it. We're switching from kind of a upfront set and forget sort of ideal of regulation into something that says, well, hang on, let's have a look at the other end and really understand why things aren't the way that we intended them to be. And I think so we're really excited and optimistic about the work, and we're looking forward to continuing it with all of you. I think we've just seen there, the team have actually put links in the chat to the document, and we're also going to send you an email later today, so you can have a closer look at the strategy and the framework. And so thank you all very much for coming and for taking the time today. Thanks.